Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening's event on inclusive leadership. I'm Hayaatun Sillem and I'm the Chief Exec of the Royal Academy of Engineering. As I'm sure you all know, yesterday was International Women in Engineering Day, INWED, to its friends, which always gives such a great opportunity to celebrate the incredible work of women engineers right around the world, our engineering heroes who are making a difference in our communities and working on societal challenges that matter to all of us. But one day a week to celebrate that's definitely not enough. So we're taking it as our theme for the whole week. The Academy is really proud to sponsor INWED each year as part of our commitment to advancing diversity and inclusion in engineering. The stubborn diversity deficit in engineering remains a source of real concern for us. Engineers shape our world. They're agents of change across so many aspects of our lives. So it's vital that our community becomes more reflective of the society that we serve, and that we can foster inclusive cultures where everyone from every gender, every part of society, every background feels welcome. So let me give you just a couple of quick examples of how we've been addressing that over the past year, when that sits alongside our long-standing diversity and inclusion leadership programme. We've launched our Fellowship Fit for the Future initiative, which is our plan to elect half of all our new fellows from groups which are currently underrepresented in the fellowship. We've launched a new bursary programme in partnership with Amazon, aimed at increasing the pipeline of women studying computer science and related engineering courses at UK universities. And we've initiated a pilot project to provide additional targeted support to women applicants and those from minority ethnic backgrounds, groups that are persistently underrepresented within UK engineering, who are applying for our research grant schemes. Women are still significantly underrepresented in the engineering profession. We all know that. And in the UK, the latest data says we're at 14.5% women in engineering roles. The data also show that women are less likely to feel included in the workplace, more likely to face barriers to progression into senior roles. And of course, Black, disabled, LGBTQ+ women and women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are highly likely to face additional barriers. And yet, research and our own experience show us that diverse teams working in inclusive cultures produce better business outcomes, outcomes that can better meet the needs of our complex society. Tonight's discussion zones in on the topic of inclusive leadership, and we've got two fantastic speakers who are going to help us explore what this means and why it matters. But let me just kick off with a couple of personal thoughts to get us going. For me, inclusive leadership means that leaders at all levels, leaders of projects, leaders of teams, consistently model behaviours that nurture diversity within those teams and create environments where all team members, diverse team members, can contribute to the full, feel valued, and can thrive. Inclusive leaders transmit the passion, the drive, the determination to achieve positive change, and they're willing to work on themselves to build their own capacity as leaders. For me, at the end of the day, inclusive, empathetic leadership is basically good leadership. It's leadership that helps create a level playing field so success is open to all. We have two brilliant leaders in engineering to explore this topic further, to take a look at where we are today and where we need to get to and what we need to do to up our game to get there. First up, we have Aleida Rios, who's the Senior Vice President of Engineering at BP. She's held a wide range of leadership posts across operations and engineering. She's on the board of BP Shipping, and as a Fellow of the Energy Institute, chairs its Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. And we have Loubna Bouarfa, who is a machine learning scientist turned entrepreneur who founded OKRA Technologies, an artificial intelligence data analytics company for healthcare, which allows healthcare professionals to combine all their data in one place and generate evidence-based insights in real time. But as well as our fantastic speakers, we've got all of you. So thank you for participating in the poll that we ran just before starting. We asked you all how confident you were about being an inclusive leader. And I'm very encouraged by the results. You may be needing to teach us a few things about inclusive leadership. I'm delighted that 80% of you, more than 80% of you in fact, said that you were very or somewhat confident in being an inclusive leader. So we're looking forward to a great discussion. I'm going to get things going by putting some questions to Aleida and Loubna, but we've got plenty of time for audience questions. So please do start popping your questions and your comments in the chat box on the right at any point, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. But first up, let's take stock of where we are. So Aleida and Loubna, I'd like to ask you both, starting with Aleida, What is your view of inclusive leadership in your sectors in 2021? And where do you think we most need to make progress? Aleida.
Hi, hello everybody, and thank you for hosting this conversation. It's fantastic, and I think it's an important question. Where are we? So a little bit about my sector. So I'm in the energy sector, oil and gas to be specific. I've been in the sector for the last 30 years. I know all of you thought I was younger than that, but I've been in the sector a very long time, and progress has been made. But we also know that this industry, this sector, is primarily men. It has been from the start, and unfortunately, it remains that way. Women, as we know, make up 48% of the global labor force, but only account for 22% of the oil and gas sector. We have made progress in the renewables sector, is 32%, so there is progress. And certainly I have seen it from my experience from when I first started in the oil fields of West Texas. And Haida, one of the most important things you already mentioned was the fact that in engineering, when you look at that, it's even less. You mentioned 14.5 here in the UK. It's 13% globally, and we really need to make a difference in the engineering sector. When you look at leaders in the sector, it's only 14% in the executive leadership positions. So one of the things I just have to emphasize that we're dealing with one of the biggest challenges of our generation in the energy transition. And this is a great opportunity. It's more than an opportunity. It's a business imperative that we create a much more inclusive leadership, because we need all the brilliant ideas, the innovation, the different perspectives to flourish so that we can solve the problems that we're facing in our generation around climate. And the energy sector is absolutely critical to solving that problem. And I want to say it's possible through deliberate action. I want to just give you an example of what deliberate action looks like. In 2020, BP set out to reinvent itself around energy. And a lot of the companies are doing this around the transition, and it's fantastic to see. But we started with selecting the leaders that we wanted to lead on this transition and the key attributes of an inclusive leader. And these are what we look for when selecting leaders in BP. Curious, open-minded, purpose-driven, emotionally connected, and empathetic. That doesn't sound like the oil and gas sector that you all grew up with, I'm sure. The outcome of that is BP's top 120 leaders in 2021 are 39% women and 24% underrepresented ethnic minority backgrounds. That's a deliberate action, and it can happen when you decide. It's progress. We're not yet satisfied with that, and we're looking to and aspiring to reach gender parity by 2025 in the top 120 leaders at BP. So that's why I'm saying the most important thing is leadership. Leadership is what transforms environments, workplaces. And we need those diverse representations to be there to solve this problem. It's a business imperative. I'll just end with that. It's not a nice to have. It isn't something that would do it just because it's nice to do and it's a good thing. No, it's business imperative. We need to have inclusive leadership to be able to solve the problem that's facing our generation, and the energy sector needs to do that transformation. I'll close with that.
Thank you, Aleida. That's really powerful and also really helpful to have it made so practical as to where you are in your journey within BP. Loubna, let me turn to you now and get your perspective.
Thank you, Hayaatun, and thank you for having me today. It's an honor to join this discussion and to discuss such a vital topic. So for me, what is really important for inclusive leadership is to embrace uncertainty, especially now in the post-COVID world, and to embrace a diverse workplace and have an open mindset. And that's the key ingredients to inclusive leadership in this post-pandemic world. I set up OKRA as a female entrepreneur to make a difference with AI and improve health outcomes. And science and technology is like engineering, is traditionally male and pale, and as a result, predictable and deterministic. and not like as women, bringing the adaptive element and the unpredictability, which is very important to processes and to this unpredictability that we're dealing with, both in business and in our lives. And because of this, we see products designed to obey rules and to cater to other men, products that are linear and rule-based. And we saw this across the different industrial revolutions that happened, whether it is the size of the phone in the palm of the hand, or the development in the different chronic diseases for health conditions for women. So bias in research, in workplace, has very clear real-world consequences. And I think by bringing diversity is very key for us. For example, at OKRA, our engineering team was mainly dominated by male, but they realized as soon as the first girl joined, they realized, wow, she brings really different perspective to how we develop our products. And the next hires, and almost now we are making great progress to gender balance, to see that it's adding value, not only the gender element, but also having 15 nationalities working together and different perspectives. And it is very important to build technology that is unbiased and that is robust to deal with the unpredictability of our world. And bringing COVID, I mean, it all showed us our dysfunctional relationship with nature from many elements, but it also brought very, very good things. For example, in the industry, in the life science industry, moving from 10 years to develop vaccine to 10 months, bringing that speed, that being adaptive, running adaptive clinical trials, moving away from the rules, from the strict inclusive and exclusive criteria. So you see the world is overnight changed, and we need more women. We can deal with unpredictability. We are more adaptive because of our nature, and that is, I think, what is really, really important. And as an engineer, I've been an electrical engineer by education. I see that we've been too long in this field stuck in the deterministic models, and where the parameters were fully determined by initial conditions, whether we are building pipelines for oil and gas, or whether we are building computer networks. We've been always in this mindset, linear, and we fantasized about in the science lab about stochastic models, about probabilistic models, and about the inherent randomness. And at the beginning, we said it's too complex. In the 80s and 70s, it's too complex to implement. It requires a lot of computing power, which we don't have. And now we have the computing power, but we think, no, but we need to understand how it works. And we know that those systems, as much as they result in a lot of efficiency, it also brought a lot of bureaucracy, and it has to make assumptions that human will adapt, which they did back in the days. Coming from the wars and that generation, they did adapt to those linear systems. But today, with Generation Z and with the millennials, we saw that how the consumer platforms changed quickly. They saw the benefits of bringing individualization, and they used more those models, those probabilistic models. And we have the big platforms exploiting that space. However, we didn't see how we can leverage it in important issues, such as in healthcare, such as in sustainability, how we can bring that probability and individualization to those fields. What will happen, and what is I'm afraid of, is that the consumer market will go directly to the consumer here, or to the patient in healthcare, and that we skip the strong ecosystem that we have built. So with you, I see inclusive leadership bringing the elements, the ingredients of diversity, the elements of embracing uncertainty, the elements of openness to build a very orchestrated human-machine interactions that adapts and doesn't assume it knows everything. It's open and adapts with the world of today. And as I am voicing the startups and the scale-ups, I have witnessed a tendency as an innovator in the industry to really stick and to value those traditional rule-based processes not because it's optimal, but because it's safe. And however, tradition, we know that tradition can stop innovation. I think it is the time. We are just in 2020, we passed by this inflection point. It is the time now to really reflect and say, okay, now it's the time for us to change as leaders, to embrace this randomness, and in our leadership style, in the way we build our processes. Nothing is figured out. And I had many occasions with my team as well. We said we don't have to have it all figured out. We start here and let's implement it, and we adapt as we go. And as much as the team was at the beginning, okay, but we need to set the requirements of the system. It needs to work in this way. But after that, it proved it's the right approach, and it's helped us to move. And that's how we also keep innovating at speed at a small company. So yeah, that's my view in inclusive leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Loubna. That's really interesting. Let's come back to the impact of the past year in a moment, but I think it's really important to dwell more on that, but that's been very helpful and stimulating. Before I actually move back to Aleida, I just want to ask you a quick question, which is that obviously there is this recurring theme now of the concern around bias in AI being embedded in the products and the services that then depend on it. Do you see things changing fast enough in the AI community? Do you look around you and see lots of inclusive leadership role models in your community?
Absolutely. Yeah, there is a lot of change in the team. So we see that not only big companies, but also small companies, they realizing that AI is more than computer scientists code, but it is more multidisciplinary teams, from ethicists to user experience, to many backgrounds. Depends on the vertical you are. It's a teamwork that working together to be able to build systems that are unbiased. Of course, bias is never going to be eliminated, because this AI systems learns from data, from historical data. What we saw in the past, when we apply AI systems to more sensor data or data that is coming directly from the machine, we're less concerned of bias. But we are moving much faster than we thought a few years ago, to using more and more human data, personal data, where bias becomes very critical. We need to find a way to control that. And having multidisciplinary teams is very, very important aspect to reduce bias. And the second element, we have more technical ways to reduce bias by balancing the data when we have the data unbalanced between the different classes. And my work at the European Commission on the ethical guidelines that of building trustworthy AI are something which we embed here at OKRA, but also for many companies to embed it in their processes for developing AI systems and creating special teams, from red teams to test the AI systems on bias and other criteria, to teams that think about the design, inclusive design, from the early start of developing such systems.
That's really encouraging to hear. Thank you, Loubna. And I'm going to now switch to the topic of what does it mean if you're an inclusive leader in terms of your leadership style? So Aleida, do you have a view on whether there are certain types of leadership style that most enable inclusive cultures? And whatever your natural starting point, how can you learn to be a more inclusive leader? Do you think it is something that you can learn?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for the question, because I do think there is enabling inclusive cultures or styles, and I'm absolutely a big believer that it can be learned. It actually needs to be practiced more than learned. It needs to be practiced all the time. So when I think about leadership styles that foster a more inclusive culture, there are those that create, first and foremost, for me, psychological safety. We talk a lot about psychological safety for our teams, right? But how does that really make people feel? It's really leaders that can really bring on their authentic selves. When you can be yourself and you can role model that, I think you build some psychological safety. That's one thing. The second is being vulnerable. Now, in the corporate world that I live in, the corporate world that I grew up in, that's just counterintuitive, right? It's counterintuitive to actually be emotional, to be personally connected, to be vulnerable, to not have all the answers. But it's so important to be that leader. And we all know that we don't have all the answers. To be that leader that's vulnerable, that doesn't have all the answers, that brings their whole self to work, that then therefore creates an environment where they're empathetic, or people feel that they're authentic and can relate to them. It's psychological safety. But I think it starts with something else, which is why I said it can be learned and needs to be practiced constantly. Self-awareness, right? We all are human, leaders as well. We all are human. And it starts with recognizing and being aware that we all have biases. We didn't grow up with these biases, but we need to understand our own biases because the culture around us, the way we were raised, who we are creates certain biases. And so that it really is that leader that's self-aware. And again, this is something that we don't often hear in the corporate world. You know, it's supposed to be the confident, the big boys, the all-knowing, and certainly not somebody that walks around with saying, I don't know, being vulnerable and saying, this isn't a great day for me today. I got it wrong. I'm sorry. But understanding that we are all need to be that vulnerable and recognizing that to be a good leader, it starts with being vulnerable and being self-aware, that you don't all have all the answers, that you need to seek understanding. There's a big reason I say seek to understand, because oftentimes we expect or look up to leaders to have all the answers, and a lot of times be right all the time, right? That is not what we need. We need leaders that are self-aware, that know that they're not always right, that are willing to learn and grow, and openly and visibly, and I have to say this, openly and visibly bring in their whole selves to work. And that means creating that creates belonging, Hayaatun. And when I feel that I can bring my boys, by the way, they're right behind me in my picture, if you can see that, I bring my boys to work all the time. I talk about them. I talk about when they were babies. I talk about how that day I wasn't looking so great because that morning one of them happened to go all over my shirt or whatever. But it creates a culture where you feel like you belong in all the differences. And I want to emphasize finally and on the point that I started, which is psychological safety, being open to listening and being uncomfortable. And practice. We all have to practice being uncomfortable.
Yeah. Wow.
I'll end on that.
That resonates so strongly. And how about you, Loubna? Because I mean, the corporate environment and culture and the startup scale-up culture, they're different worlds sometimes. But does that resonate with you? Are there additional builds on that you would add around how we can all learn and practice being inclusive leaders?
Absolutely. I think for us as a small company, and it is already embedded in the way we started, and it's one of our, and it's easier to implement when you're a small team. I think for me, it's really, it's about creating that environment, experimental environment where one can fail and stand again. And it's not only about getting it right all the time, and not for everybody. And it is with the team, and when they experiment that, because you can tell them, but once you experience it yourself, it's easier to embrace. And I saw it when we discussed, like, we have a flat structure, and the way we work together is in teams, which is really, I think, one of the key ingredients as well, because when you work as a team, you have a goal. Your goal to create something or to win, or so it's just like with sport, with team sports. And when we have a common goal, you see when there is an issue, people step up, and it works by itself. And it's so amazing to see after a few years now how we moved from playing music without sheets, that the sheets are created by itself and it's working, and the dynamic is there, and that everyone is focused on the goal. And I think that helps. And it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, or it's about your contribution, your contribution, your passion, and bringing that to the table. But to release that and to unleash this passion from people, I think it's very good to create that environment where people share, and the culture to be transparent, and to have the no shame culture, or no a culture of openness, of listen, it is, I can understand for the big corporates, it's sometimes difficult to implement that, especially everyone has an opinion. Everyone has an opinion, it counts. But it has a lot of advantages. It delivers on the value created, the speed of the value created, and I think the problem of diversity inside a startup, I'm talking from my startup, but I think also for other startups, it's not inside. It's you look for a higher level. Currently, if you look to the UK, just 22% of small and medium businesses are female owned. So the bias is more on the higher level, and this huge potential for growth, and to change this figure, and to bring diversity to a higher level, not only on the teams. And I think we can do there a lot to change that.
Fantastic. There's some things I want to pick up on, but actually I've got some great questions coming through. So I'm going to start feeding those in, and we'll come back to some of the other points in a minute. So one of the things we've been challenged on here is, it's great that we're talking about this. What about the leaders who aren't in the room today and who might need to be the ones engaged in the inclusive leadership conversation? What can we do to engage those who aren't already in the room? And we had a couple of people, Dr. Joanne Lewis and Georgia Council, both gave us variants of this question. So Loubna or Aleida, any reactions to that? I'm going to try and ask you to keep your answers relatively tight, just so we can get through as many questions as possible.
I can start. I think we need to start having, we're calling them conversation cafes, and getting really uncomfortable. I mentioned how we need to make sure and force people to get uncomfortable. That's what we're doing. We're doing a lot of what we call conversational cafes, which are, the goal of that is to really seek to understand, rather than going in there and having all the answers, and honestly being okay with, you're going to make a mistake, you're going to say the wrong thing, and you just need to just be okay with that. Yeah, absolutely. Loubna, any further thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it is part of the adaptive element, to keep learning and growing, and not assume or create a culture where people think, now I'm a leader, so I have no duty to make mistakes or to learn and adapt. And I think that's the first step to recognize the value and importance of inclusivity. It's about learning and adapting, and creating that environment.
Absolutely. And I think, Aleida, your point about psychological safety applies to those people in leadership roles already, to actually create that environment in which people in senior leadership, or whatever kind of leadership roles, feel that we are all constantly learning, and we all need to have humility. None of us have got this. It's not like, we're the inclusive leaders and you're not. This is a shared process that never stops. And actually, every organization, leaders need to acknowledge that ongoing development is part of their responsibility. So that's the hook, I think, for trying to engage people in this conversation about inclusion. And we had a comment here saying, why do we still talk about business benefits rather than saying it's because it's the right thing to do? And I think that actually that is one of the advantages. I certainly firmly believe, I'm sure you do too, that the moral case for diverse inclusion is so clear cut, but yet for some people, using the hook of business benefit, business outcome, is a way to engage them in a conversation they otherwise wouldn't join in. So it has its place, but I take the point, Jan, that we should not hide behind that when it's just the right thing to do. So I've got another question here, actually, I can relate to this. So Molly Edlin is saying, in the context of this idea that, leaders have to bring their whole selves to work and be vulnerable and be open and be willing to be uncomfortable, what about boundaries and not bringing home life problems to work? Reflections on that one, please.
I I think that came to life in the pandemic. I mean, we have. I'll just say that this is very much on my mind around boundaries, because we have all felt that we've lost those as we've gotten into the pandemic and having working from home and doing the hybrid working. I wanted to build on this question a little bit and talk about what worries me about the hybrid model and the way that we're working now for women in particular and underrepresented groups is that women carry a lot more of the load. We know that when it comes to support at home, etc., carrying responsibilities. And the whole idea of, and then on top of that, the whole idea of having no boundaries, I think is going to put an additional load. What we've been thinking about and doing in that space is so important that flexibility is looked at from what people need instead of one size fits all. So, for example, a new employee in the company will need something very different in terms of the way they work than maybe a woman who's just had 3 children and taking care of them at the home. We need to make sure that what we provide to our employees and to the talent is what's needed for them. And one size doesn't fit all. And I really think we need to think about this in terms of the consequences this might have for underrepresented groups and in particular women as we come out of the pandemic and live in what's been a great opportunity, right? I don't want to give up what we've learned, which is the hybrid working. So this is an excellent conversation. I could keep going on this, but I want to get, Loubna's thoughts as well on this because it's something that we really have to work on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, spot on. And let's keep this going for a bit. So Loubna, what are your perspectives, either building on Aleida's comments about the pros, but also the cons of the hybrid model, but also going back to Molly's question about those boundaries between personal and professional life. What's your experience? What are your thoughts on this?
I am completely probabilistic. I don't like boundaries or rules. So but what I believe is you need when we are working with passion, when we do our job, we are stepping out of ourselves we're putting the hat of our professional self and working on something with passion. Of course, we're not gonna forget about our children, our problems, but we are almost and we need that abstraction. That's why we love our work. That's why we do science. That's why and I think by giving that environment where people, regardless of what is happening, or regardless what is the problems, can contribute with that passion and unleash that is inside, whether regardless of their problems. I think that is what is important. I don't believe we have to set rigid boundaries because we're human beings. We can set them, but every rule that we make, it's gonna get broken. So
I admire you, Loubna, because I have to say I relate very much to this kind of the feeling of the safety that comes with boundaries. So I certainly was somebody who really, really liked to compartmentalize life. And Aleida, was one of those people that had an internal meltdown when the pandemic took that away from me. And I had to do meeting after meeting with children sitting by my laps. And, I found it amplified the stress of an already stressful time. And I would say personally, I've been on a journey, sorry to use a cliche, in my career whereby I realized that, the cost of not wanting to focus on the personal is that you are less effective at creating that feeling of a space where everybody else can bring their full selves to work without inhibition, without knocking the corners off themselves. So I'm still on that pathway to learning. I also think there's a part of it that is saying it's okay if for whatever reason you choose not to share something, because that is necessary for our own self-care and our own ability to sustain the different dimensions of our life. So I think it's a fine balance, but I definitely agree with you both that in the end, if you really want to create an environment where everyone feels free to be themselves, we've got to model that. So I'm on my journey there. I've got some more questions for you guys. So I've got a question from my colleague, Meredith Ettridge, who said, what advice would you give someone who's in a leadership position on how they can ensure they're being as inclusive as they can be? How do we foster that mindset in ourselves? I think it's a really great practical question. So, Loubna, I'll turn to you first and then come to you, Aleida.
How we foster that in ourselves. I think it helps a lot to listen. I think it's brought here to really listen and understand from other people's perspective, or and also there are, of course, goals that we want to meet, and we cannot get all over the place by thinking, okay, this is I'm getting pulled to all directions. And I think one of the difficult things during the pandemic is not because we were working, there was no boundaries. I think because we were sitting in the same chair, in the same place, wearing all the hats at the same time, which is very confusing. That was, I think, the problem, not because we, yeah, the way we can foster that is really by learning and experimenting, and when we talk to people, see what the reaction is and adapting that. And I think that's there is no perfect way to do it, except that we keep learning.
Great, Loubna. And Aleida, thoughts from you as well?
I think certainly I'll speak for myself. What I'm practicing and constantly practicing is just staying curious. I recognize that I will lean towards those things that already that I'm already like, right? That I enjoy. So I purposely am trying to find ways to interject myself on things that I might not be as comfortable, and be curious. And Loubna, absolutely, that creates experimentation, because if you're curious, you also, if you have that curious learning mindset, you will also experiment. And let's start honestly and saying, when we experiment, don't get it right. So be okay with failing. Be okay with that, because remember, every time we're learning something, come on, all of us have tried to learn something, ride a bike, swim, ski, whatever sport you can think of, even, calculations or whatever. When did we get it right the first time we tried it? And then we expect that, but it started with curiosity. I want to learn something, right? I want to learn about that. I don't know anything about it. And I think we need to also have that curiosity with behaviors and people. And guess what happens? The minute you recognize that something triggered in something in you that made you uncomfortable, emotional, angry, excited, whatever, that is when it's something you don't actually know yet or learn from. And that's when you lean into, why did that make me uncomfortable? Especially if it makes you your reaction is something of a, no way. Yeah. That's not right. So that's it. Curiosity for me, in short.
Great. And I would just add to that, the constant reminding yourself that we are all subject to assumptions. The human brain works by making connections between things that aren't real. It's, we're super smart that way, but sometimes the connections we make are erroneous. So if you just remember that we're all doing this all the time, and believe that we can build empathy. I think people sometimes think empathy is like an innate thing. You either have it or you don't. But empathy starts from remembering that everyone experiences the world differently. And so it's back to your point about openness, isn't it? And curiosity. It's reminding yourself as a leader that you are no less subject to that tendency than anybody else. And if you keep watching it happen in yourself, then you start to be able to preempt it and, have a little dialogue with yourself about whether that reaction is quite what you want it to be. So yeah, great. So there's loads more great questions coming in. I'm going to keep trying to push through them. And I do want to come back to this past year as well to talk about what we've learned, not just about the impact of different ways of working on women, but particularly the issue of who is most impacted by inequality, who is most impacted. We can't have this conversation without talking about Black Lives Matter. And I know, Aleida, you've got thoughts on the issue of equity alongside diversity and inclusion. So come, let's do this now. It's really important we cover this. So let's do this, and then I'm going to go back to my questions from the audience. Aleida, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah. So in relation to 2020 and Black Lives Matter, I actually think it was it was always happening. It's been happening for a very long time. But George Floyd, the tragedy of George Floyd really became a catalyst. And one of the things we have to recognize in the Black Lives Matters conversation of the underrepresented, marginalized groups is that it's systematic, right? It again, being open to recognizing that we all are part of that system, and starting with ourselves. So one of the very first things that this led to for us is it started with having very, very, very uncomfortable conversations. The conversations were actually about listening.
Mm-hmm.
What does it feel like to live that experience?
Mm-hmm.
Back to your point about we can all learn how to put ourselves into situations that make us much more empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
Out of that, though, after we've listened and we've put ourselves in that situation, it has to be action.
Yeah.
Right? It has to be action. And one of the things that we're talking about is, and we've now added equity to the conversation. And I say added it because it's always something that's probably been there and needed, but we've added it very purposefully, saying that there's a difference between equality, giving everybody the same thing, and equity, giving people what they need. But you have to really understand what people need, walk in their shoes, before you can define that. And this is very important, especially for African Americans, for other marginalized groups, because as an example, I'll just give you an example that resonates with me, because I come from an engineering manufacturing culture. When I started, there wasn't any fire retardant clothing, the FRCs, the work gloves that they give you. It was all metal, and they didn't fit, and they don't fit. There's a thing we do that's called water survival. Some of you might have done it, where you have to get into your fire retardant clothing. You have to do all these flips. You have to swim. I had to do that in FRCs that were 3 times my size. By the way, I'm a pretty petite woman. Do you think I could perform well with that piece of clothing? Well, the same thing happens at the workplace when we give the same piece of clothing, the same resource to an African American woman, for example. So we really need to recognize this equity conversation. And what we've done is we've set a framework for action that starts with transparency, with accountability, and really focusing on the different talent that we want and what do they need. So I'm glad you brought up the conversation of Black Lives Matters, because it is very important. Yeah. But we do need to take action and really focus on equity.
Yeah. No, I think that's super important. We should, so many things we need to discuss and not enough time. But Loubna, this issue of our engineered world not providing inclusive outcomes, not serving all groups in society equitably, is super important. And in the context of AI, it's almost magnified. So as a leader, what's your role in hardwiring inclusive design into your products and into your services? And how do you make sure that that's not an afterthought, or it's not just driven by customer need, but as a principle?
Yeah, no, it's a really important. Funnily enough, just a week ago, I was in call with one of my colleagues at the head of expert group on the ethical work we did for the commission, and we discussed, because we've been for hours and days discussing about bias and how to build fairness into AI. And then COVID hit, and all those ethical principles that we were discussing for machines, the first moral test, the big moral test our world gone through, we saw none of these principles are kind of adhered, and you could see it was a moral test for humanity. We say that the virus has no borders, but we saw that every country had a different response to the virus, almost like a mirror, mirror to their own moral strategies. And that's one of the important things when we design AI systems, and we're faced to the idea to the big ethical questions. How can we make AI inclusive? How can we make AI not biased? How this should be the key principles of designing any AI systems, regardless of whether we are working in with less critical data, or whether we're working on personal data. but it always be a mirror to us. It will always mirror our behavior. We saw it with the, with the JSC algorithm use when everyone was on the street saying algorithms are unfair, and how that provoked the reaction of unfairness in the society. So finally, algorithms are just a tool to help us to automate some things. And as a leader, and at OKRA, for example, for us, it's really key to have some key elements that are important for our space in healthcare. For example, explainability. Explainability is one of the key principles in implementing our AI systems. Whatever suggestions we provide, whatever predictions, it needs to be underpinned with reasons, because finally the user that's going to read that needs to know why the AI system chose that. Of course, AI doesn't have all the data figured out. Some data, it's not been fed up to the used in the system. So we need to also explain that because of this correlation, it's not always causality. There is correlation in the data. That's why we see this. And having that transparency in system design is very key to the user adoption, to empower the users and not bypass them. And I think it's some of, not only AI needs to learn from that, but also as humans, we need to learn to do that ourselves as well.
I'm sure you're right. Now, I've got some more questions here. I want to try squeeze in as many as possible. Thank you all for keeping your questions coming. So there are two related questions from Laura Aiken and from Margaret Ross. And so Margaret's asking about role models being more visible when they maybe are within an organization, but they're not visible to top management. And Laura's asking for the challenge that we often hear about, which is you get a D&I pull from the top of an organization, a D&I push from the bottom, but sometimes there is a perception that the middle layer of an organization, so I guess it particularly applies in corporates, Aleida, might not be quite as committed to that accelerating pace of change as those other groups. So maybe I'll start with you, Aleida. What's your perception of that, and any suggestions? I think people are looking particularly for practical ideas as to how you counteract that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we call it the frozen middle, and oftentimes we've talked about this as well. And it's absolutely a dynamic that occurs. You know, top leadership is saying the right things, doing the right things, and in the bottom, the BRGs, the business resource groups, are doing it the same thing. But then you have this middle layer that's quite frozen. What we've done that's very, very practical, and I encourage others to think about it. It starts with, and I've mentioned already, but I'll give you the details. It starts with transparency. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we often don't do is actually show where we are, you know, be very transparent. And I mean gender, I mean LGBT, I mean all the different strands of diversity. Where are we? So first of all, if you're not getting that information, ask for it. We actually are publishing it internally and externally. All right, to hold ourselves to the second action, to account, right? Transparency, and then hold yourself to account. Hold those leaders to account across top and bottom, right? The accountability is top and bottom. The bottom can be accountable for the direction where they want to get to. The top obviously is when they're being transparent. And then the middle will then be rewarded for delivering it, right? Because the accountability follows the transparency. And then the other thing, the third item that I think we need to work on is the talent pipelines. Mm-hmm. So, right, talent, how you develop it, how you nurture it, how you progress it. So having a real clear strategy around all your talent streams. Obviously, for me, engineering is a big one, but there's talent streams within your organization. So being very practical, transparency, accountability, and talent, and focus on talent. Those are the things that all of us can do, and everybody plays a role, mm-hmm. right? And that transparency drives the accountability. And then you have to work on your talent pipeline, because then you see where your gaps are. And if you're not going to deliver them, you're not going to perform, and you're not going to get rewarded for that. And therefore, guess what? Things happen. Progress is made. But it really does have to start with being transparent to where you want to get to, and then driving that accountability.
Great. Thanks, Aleida. And Loubna, feel free to come back and speak. I want to feed in another question for you to pick up on, which is from Carolyn Griffiths, who's saying, okay, we have to accept failure. That's great in principle. But how do you reconcile this with the fact that failure can have serious consequences